Hello, everybody. You are listening to Through Time and Clades. My name is Albert.
I'm Joan.
All right. So we are back with a new news episode. We're going to be talking about sciencey stories that caught our attention last month, which was March of 2024. But before then, tell me a little bit about how you've been doing lately.
Oh, I've been doing as well as I can. I know the last episode that we recorded, I mentioned that I had gotten a non-freelance job recently at an antique store, and that has been going. It's been going okay. The biggest thing is just kind of getting used to a non-freelance schedule,
Hmm.
um, because it's one of those situations where it happens so quickly that I'm moving into a whole new schedule. Um, and then I've had my schedule like changed and rechanged like two additional times.
Right.
Um, so it's been quite a bit, but I've been communicating with other friends who also have non-freelance schedules and kind of getting tips from them. And thankfully, I've been able to really kind of um, figure things out a little bit easier and have things go smoothly from there. So it's really great to have this job. I've been able to pay a lot of my bills. I had taxes that came up. I was able to take care of that. It's been really nice otherwise. I mean, my managers are very sweet and understanding, and they give me a very flexible schedule, and it's not like retail. It's not like retail where it's just a whole rush of stuff. Um, but it's really nice. I like antique stores, and I really enjoy going to them. So it's been kind of a fun experience to be in one of these
Hmm.
and kind of experience like what the day to day is like. So I'm really happy about that. Um, Otherwise, I guess the biggest kind of highlight of recent weeks was I went to an arts festival. This was, as of this recording, last Sunday, so the 14th, and they had all kinds of vendors there that were making necklaces and soaps and jewelry and things like that. And it was all kind of like outdoor spring nature themed, which is really fun. Delicious food truck food. Um, it was sponsored by the Museum of Contemporary Art in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and they had a really awesome special exhibit there that I got to go tour a little bit of. The museum is free entry, including the special exhibits. Um, it was called Journey to Nature's Underworld, and it was a two-artist exhibition for Mark Dion and Alexis Rockman, and it kind of highlighted a lot of their work from between 1990 and 2022. Basically exploring kind of the history of natural history and the impacts of human activities on the environment in a very like direct way. I don't know how familiar these artists may be to some of y'all, but their work is really provocative and really beautifully done. They highlight a lot of like Southeast Asian wildlife and this commentary on like the scala naturae, the old fashioned, the the hierarchy that the ancients used to classify living and non-living matter into, that has kind of never really left our lexicon in a way.
Hmm.
How you may have heard of like higher and lower animals, for example, that in some small ways that's still around. And they also explore like the Anthropocene event. So they had like an old-fashioned natural history cabinet for collections, but instead of animal specimens, it was all plastic from the Great Pacific um, plastic like island that's there. So I just really wanted to highlight that at least. That was especially fun. They had 30 enormous paintings in all. Um, and so it's kind of going on right now. If you happen to be in the Eastern Virginia area or, Eastern North Carolina, it's from February 9th to June 9th of this year. Museum of Contemporary Art in Virginia. It's free entry. I highly encourage anybody who happens to be in the area to check it out and support the artists for sure because that was a really surprising and exciting exhibit. But that was really my biggest highlights. How about you, Albert?
Well, to be honest, not much has changed for me. Um, yeah, kind of, don't really have any major life events to update on. Yeah, I guess it's another one from me where I'm saying that there are things happening, but they're not really particularly interesting to talk about, at least not yet. So yeah, but I'm doing fine. Things are good, and I've been enjoying the springtime over here. Been seeing lots of birds. Birds are singing and kind of establishing territories and pairing up, and all kinds of interesting behaviors going on. And a lot of birds that normally would be quite secretive are kind of a little easier to see at this time of the year, partly because the foliage is not too thick yet, and so they aren't as hidden, and partly because a lot of the songbirds, for example, are singing their songs, and you can often locate them that way. Yeah, I would say I've been doing pretty well, and things are going pretty okay.
Well, that your spring has been going well so far. I have been having it hard with the pollen. It
Right,
it is
yeah.
it has never been this bad before. I don't know what it is. Every time I go out for even at work, even for like 5 minutes, I'm all of a sudden all sniffly and going through like a half a tissue box a day.
I'm sorry to hear that because yes, I definitely did used to suffer from pollen allergies as well. No, oddly enough, they haven't been all that bad since I've moved to the UK. So it's been a while since I've had a really bad experience with that. But yes, I have been there. It is not fun.
Gotcha. Well, I imagine the tree management is a little bit different there in the UK, where there's
Mhm.
not so many, you know, male conifers that
Right.
seem to be preferential around here for some reason. Um, it's good to hear. I mean, I'm sure I'll adjust in time, but I mean, it definitely makes work a little bit just slightly more difficult because every 5 minutes I got to pull a tissue out and
Mhm.
working on something. It's not exactly an appealing sight when you go into a store and freaking computer lady is there blowing her nose all the damn time. Um, but I will persevere. It will all be okay. Um, and hey, we got a fun episode for y'all today.
Mhm.
It was another month, March, where there was a lot of really great stories um, that we could have chosen, but when we decided to settle on the stories that we chose, we kind of had an unintentional theme arise. So
Yes.
this is going to be kind of a mammal march news episode
That's true.
where all of our stories are mammal themed. Uh, which is funny because I'm just reminded that I guess we also have mammal March Madness going on right now too.
Yeah.
So it's like a layer on that. And we have another mammal themed thing as well. So
Right.
if we jump right now to the next slide, um, yeah, so the next landmark BBC Natural History series is currently airing. And what do you know? It's about mammals. In fact, it's just called Mammals. And
Mhm.
it's, of course, a David Attenborough presentation. Now, of course, he has since retired from world travel, so he presents. I guess he presents at the beginning, but then he's mostly a narrator all the way through, kind of like
Right.
Planet Earth or Blue Planet, that sort of thing. Yeah, so this is a 6 episode series which covers basically the different types of environmental conditions to which mammals have adapted to in the last 66 million years, um, as well as looking at their interactions with human beings and their impact, which is kind of par for the course for these sorts of shows. um, Although what was interesting is that apparently the human impact episode was not the finale. It was like the second episode of this thing, which
Yeah.
is kind of surprising because usually they save that for the end, but I guess they decided to go differently this time around. But now, granted, I have not seen the series yet, um, but there's been a lot of like publicity surrounding it,
Mhm.
and so I understand. Of course, we have a lot of new footage to look forward to. Some of the highlights that I picked that seemed interesting include polar bears hunting reindeer,
Mm.
um, parental care in wolverines,
Yep. Mm.
chimpanzees mining for honeybees under the ground, um, as well as wild fennec fox behaviors,
mm,
um,
mm,
and new orca hunting behaviors. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg there. But it seems like another very lovely series with some really great footage. Hopefully, it has a pretty good scope of mammalian coverage because I know you know the tendency to focus on the big megafauna, the charismatic mammals, is pretty high in these sorts of shows. To
right.
the exclusion of like shrews and rodents and bats
Mm,
and
mm,
Afrotherians and that sort of thing. So I guess that will remain to be seen. Now, of course, that being said, this is not necessarily a remake of The Life of Mammals, which was a more personal series that Attenborough hosted for his Life collection. Um, and so this first premiered on the 31st of March on BBC One. Of course, it's the 16th now. So that would mean that I think 3 episodes have aired
yep.
already,
Mm.
3 or 2, something like that. So it's
Yeah, it's
still
pretty good, I
ongoing.
think.
So if you happen to be, connected, um, you can catch it right now as it's airing. Um, but if you have the BBC iPlayer, they are uploading it to that as well. Um,
Yep. Mm,
and then, of course, I don't know for sure when they come to the United States or to other countries. Um, but I'm sure when we get that information, we'll follow up on this and let you all know because we like to share the latest natural history media with y'all to kind of tickle your fancy as a supplement to the
mm,
show.
mm,
And of course, we'll provide links to 2 articles as well in the description. Um, one is this enormous article, which is full of like interviews with like a whole bunch of crew members talking about their experiences working on the show. And the other one is technically more about Attenborough in retrospective, looking
mm.
at his career and reflections on that. But he does talk a little bit about his work on mammals, so we'll share those as well. Um, Now, Albert, I know you're in the UK. Have you seen
Mhm.
anything from this yet?
So I haven't actually watched the episodes that are out yet, but they are out. Yeah, as you said, 3 of them have come out so far. That much I'm aware of. But the series is still ongoing, so there will be more coming in the coming weeks. I have seen various clips that the BBC has been uploading to YouTube and so on, and certainly what they have put out there looks very impressive, as is par for the course for these big BBC natural history documentaries. Certainly, a lot of very cinematic um, filmmaking and some very novel behaviors of the animals on display. So I'm sure this will be another really great series. And I do look forward to seeing it eventually. But yeah, I'll be honest. Like I feel like I've fallen off a little bit, like kind of following these big nature documentaries closely in recent years. Like I still haven't finished Planet Earth 3, which was the kind of big documentary of this sort that came out last year. Um, I watched like about half of the series, but I haven't caught up with the last part yet. It's something that is a little curious to me personally, because of course natural history is like my main interest, I would say, and I do enjoy watching these documentaries. I think they're great. They're always very well done on multiple fronts. Um, but yeah, there is something that I feel like I have been feeling a little bit of a nature documentary fatigue, I guess you could call it. Um, and part of that I feel like is that in the end, a lot of these documentaries feel pretty samey in a way, at least in recent years. I feel like a lot of them haven't really had much individual character, if that makes sense. Like the way they shoot these things and the way they promote these things, and structure these things nowadays. I feel like the different series are all kind of follow a very similar way of doing things, and it's not that the material itself is repetitive, because every one of these big series, they come out with like some pretty new stuff and even make scientific discoveries based on the footage that they capture. But it's just that I feel like I get the sense that the way they present things and show things, it often feels very formulaic, or at least it's been that way for a bit. Whereas if I go back to some of the older documentaries, like David Attenborough's Life series that you mentioned previously, I feel like the law of lows are a bit more individualistic and have their own personal touch to them, I suppose. That makes them, to me at least, it feels a little bit more engaging, or at least it keeps things fresher. So yeah, I feel like I haven't been like quite on the ball when it comes to catching up with these new series, but like from an objective standpoint, they are very well done, and I'm sure that I will enjoy them whenever I do get around to watching them. Um, Something else about this series specifically, I would say that I don't know how should I put this, like kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and I know some other people were bothered by this too. Was how it was marketed. Um, so of course this series is all about mammals. It's focused specifically on mammals, which is fine. It's understandable why you would want to make a series just about mammals, because after all, we are mammals, and so naturally that's a group of animals that a lot of people tend to be most interested in, and it's easier to kind of sell to the general audience. Um, but there were some very grandiose claims that were made, and very arguable claims that were made in the marketing that was done for this series. Most notably, in the I think the press release for the series, it was mentioned that, oh yes, this series will show viewers why or how mammals became the most successful group of animals on Earth. And I know quite a lot of biologists and other people who are just interested in natural history in general uh, very much took exception to that statement, and so did I, because yeah, it's like, what do you mean by most successful group of animals ever? It really
Hmm.
depends on what kind of standard you're using to make that statement. And certainly, if we were to use some kind of metric like number of species, then mammals wouldn't be anywhere close to being as successful as, say, insects, for example, or even to many of the other major vertebrate groups like birds or ray-finned fishes, or even just lizards. Yeah, there are more species of lizards alone than there are of mammals that are alive today. So yeah, mammals do lots of cool things, and there are lots of great, really interesting species of mammals. I don't think you need to resort to that kind of hyperbole to be able to sell this show. It just seemed like rather kind of disingenuous on the BBC's part. Um, so yeah, there are a few things about this series that uh, I'm not completely happy with, but I'm again like from what I've actually seen of the show, like what is being shown in the show itself, I think it looks pretty good. Like I definitely want to check it out at some point. Um, and yeah, I know you mentioned that this is not the same thing as The Life of Mammals, which was like a more personal David Attenborough led documentary. Um, but I do know that in like press releases and interviews, the people who worked on this series do mention that it is inspired by The Life of Mammals. So it is in on some level kind of intended to be a spiritual successor to that, which makes sense. And it does kind of raise the possibility that maybe they're thinking about doing similar types of spiritual successor series to David Attenborough's other series. Like he also did The Life of Birds and The Life in Cold Blood and The Life in the Undergrowth, which was on invertebrates. And so I wonder if we can expect to see series like those arise in the coming years. And yeah, hopefully those series will show that other groups of animals are at least as successful, or if not more so, than mammals, depending on how you measure success. So, yes. That's probably all I have to say about this for now because I haven't actually seen the show properly, but it's cool. If you do have a chance to watch it, um, I certainly highly encourage that. Yeah, do you have anything else to add?
Well, I think I can certainly see what you're talking about regarding kind of your opinions on the recent BBC series kind of being samey. It definitely feels like there's a formula that is always being hit every time one of these comes out. And yeah, again, as much as I enjoy them too, and I always try to make a point to catch them at some point, um, very few in recent times, like I'm talking about maybe the last 5 years or so,
Hmm,
have
hmm,
stuck with me in the way that some of the older ones have.
right.
Um, I know you've mentioned a couple times already on the show that The Hunt was one of your favorite
Yeah. Hmm,
of the BBC Landmark series of the past like decade or so.
hmm, hmm,
Um, and that one certainly seemed, yeah, more inspired, more coordinated. The narrative that they had to tell was very good and kind of unique for the series.
right.
Um, like I can point that one out. Um, but something like Planet Earth 2 or um, I don't know, Seven Worlds, One Planet. It's like they're fun to watch, and sometimes I'll even have them in the background while I'm working on other things.
Hmm,
But nothing has ever really stuck out to me where I'm like, oh, this changed, my idea of what a nature documentary could be. You
right.
know,
Right.
um, like of course I'm kind of a nerd. I kind of hold out hope that something like Life on Earth that David Attenborough done
Hmm,
could come
yes.
back in a new form with its format and kind of retain the didactic style. But that's not what documentaries are like anymore. So I kind of don't expect to see something like that anytime soon. I would like to, and I think it would be very, very nice, just like considering the state of natural history nowadays. Um, but I'm not holding my breath.
Right.
Um, and definitely like kind of echoing my iffiness about this series too. I can see exactly what you mean. It definitely feels like they're pulling on again the Scala Torre that I was referring
Yeah.
to earlier, where
Right. Right.
they're mammals and mammals are the best because we're mammals and that's how we measure success, I guess. I do know that there's been some weird controversies this
Hmm.
show. So apparently, because I looked this out, I won't go too deep into this, but when I was looking up information about the show to share with everyone, um, apparently the second episode, which is the human impact one, um, there was a sequence in Zimbabwe which shows elephants walking through like a residential neighborhood because that's kind of how things are in the world right now. There's not a lot of wild, like quote unquote wild spaces left, so animals just kind of have to go through our backyards and stuff to find food and get around. Um, Apparently, a bunch of people thought that the elephants were made with AI and were incorporated into the show. And of course,
Okay.
we are in the age of AI, and people seem to get fooled by this sort of stuff. But the directors and filmmakers had come in and say, no, it's just a special camera technique, so we could actually film the elephants without them attacking us because they're elephants,
Right.
and kind of going into it. Um, I'm just kind of like, wow, are we at this point now with documentaries where people are wondering if we're putting AI into these things? I kind of don't know how to feel about this. Worried?
Hmm.
Um, because of course the BBC series haven't exactly been free from criticism of quote unquote faking their footage in what is supposed to be a documentary that's true. Um, but and I think we've talked a little bit about this before. These sorts of shows are almost always doctored in some way without sacrificing the educational quality of the
Hmm. Hmm.
material. Because, like for example, filming the nature scenes, you want to be able to show lions hunting zebras in nature, but they've had to edit out all the car noises because they're filming
Right.
from these jeeps and like using like these high quality photography and like drone footage, right? And you don't want to have this documentary going while the narrator's talking about the animals, and then you just hear like propellers and engines in the background.
Right.
Um, so of course they're going to go in and edit things and add noises and um, that sort of thing. Uh, it's I mean, I have mixed feelings about it, but at the end of the day, like, I kind of accept it for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it doesn't bother me as much when I watch some of these and, like, I can know, like, "Oh, that lion's not the same as that lion in that shot. You're just using that to tell a story." It it really doesn't bother me personally. I mean, I don't know about
Mm-hmm.
you.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think a lot of these, post-processing techniques are very much understandable as to why they're done the way they are. I think it's something that we as viewers should keep in mind, but I don't think it necessarily detracts from the educational value of these series. Kind of on a different note, but kind of relating back to what you said about most of the recent series not really sticking with you, and I would agree that that's been the case for me too. Like, yeah, I think that's one of the things that kind of has been giving me this fatigue, I suppose, is that I feel like for many of these series, unless there's some really strong theme to them, like Blue Planet is of course all about oceans, and Frozen Planet is about cold environments. It would be easy to identify footage from those series, but for a lot of like the global series that they've been making recently, like the different Planet Earth series and Seven Worlds, One Planet, and a Perfect Planet. Yeah, they really keep reusing very similar titles for these. Um, like, if you were to take some random segment from most of these series and showed them to me, I would not be able to guess like which one they came from, or at least I would probably have to think about it. I wouldn't say this is necessarily a criticism of these series. It's just kind of the way things are done nowadays. It's like I feel like the studios have hit upon this successful formula, and so they just keep reusing it, and that's fair enough. Like what works works, right? Um, and certainly they do keep kind of pushing the boundaries when it comes to the types of things that they're able to show and the techniques that they're able to use when it comes to catching wildlife footage, and I'm sure the general public loves it, and I love it too. Um, so I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily, but like I do kind of miss some of the older formatting of the nature documentaries, um, like the ones that David Attenborough would like do more on-screen presenting on, for example. Um, but yeah, well, that's kind of the way things are now, and time will tell if we'll see more innovation in the future. And yeah, it's some of my stray musings about about nature documentaries.
Well, for sure. I mean, listen, BBC or whoever, if you want to impress me, you know what would be really great to see? Do like Parasite Planet. Do a whole series
Ooh.
with macro photography, parasitic plants and insects, worms, and show all their weird, crazy life histories, and you can theme them all in a certain way. That would be cool. Or like life in the soil, right? Again, macro
Mm,
photography. Show those soil mites and springtails and nematodes and kind of what that world is like. Um, at least that would be fresh. I don't know exactly
yeah.
how appealing it would be to some viewers, but I mean, I would probably find a world of joy in something like this because,
Yeah,
I mean,
that
one,
would
it's
be
new.
amazing.
Yeah. And it just also would, again, kind of steer away from the trope that nature, in all capitals, is, big mammals on the savannah or,
Right.
pretty birds in a tropical rainforest or
Mhm.
ocean fish. It's also the little things. And yeah, I've noticed that. I haven't really seen a lot of focus on, microinvertebrates in these recent shows. Like, I think the most recent one I can think about is I think it's like Micro Life with David Attenborough, where it
Hmm.
was like a 3 episode thing where like he talked about different insects and they had special tiny cameras that followed him around. Um, but that was like a decade ago, so
Hmm.
I can't really think when they've done anything like that recently. But yeah, invertebrates and more plants. I mean, I
Yeah.
think I think out of the recent series, if I had to like put a finger on this was the one that I thought was especially nice. It was
Right.
probably the Green Planet.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Um, admittedly, it's a shorter series, but I think that was more of a spiritual successor to the private life of plants,
Yeah.
then I imagine mammals would probably be to the life of mammals. But again, I would have to watch mammals to see if that's actually the case. Um, but yeah, we could go on and on about this, and it probably would be like it would make for a fun episode to like look at these documentaries. But for right
Yeah.
now, we probably should move on. Albert, I do believe you have first dibs on March stories, so why don't you
Yes,
go
I
ahead and show
believe
us
so.
what you got?
Sure thing. So yes, it is a little ironic that I just kind of complained about the BBC like being all like mammals are the best, blah blah blah, and they're doing yet another mammal documentary. But the way things shook out, we ended up picking like a whole combo platter of mammal stories for this month. So, I guess we are definitely not immune to the appeal of mammals. Um, and so, for our first story that we'll start off with here, we're going to talk about some very interesting mammals called echidnas. Yeah, these are really cool mammals, I think. Um, so, if you're not familiar with echidnas, they're one of the few living mammals that lay eggs. And so the only mammals today that still lay eggs are the four species of echidna, as well as the probably better known one species of platypus. These two groups are pretty closely related. They both belong to a group of mammals called the monotremes. When you kind of read introductory texts about mammals, you often see the monotremes being referred to as the egg-laying mammals. Um, and they're often presented as being like, wow, look at them. They're the only egg-laying mammals today. Isn't that weird? Um, but the truth is, like, the reason that monotremes lay eggs is not because they specifically evolved that as a different reproductive strategy from other types of mammals. Um, it's really us mammals who don't lay eggs that kind of did the weird thing by not laying eggs anymore. Vertebrates in general lay eggs, right? So basically, egg laying is the original condition for all types of vertebrates, including mammals. And probably in the distant past, when there were other groups of mammals, many of which are now extinct, um, many of them would have been egg layers. We would be talking about things that were alive during the Mesozoic, the so-called age of dinosaurs. Probably a lot of the mammals groups back then were egg-laying species. Um, but it so happens that the groups of mammals that have survived to present day, most of them belong to a lineage that has stopped laying eggs. So that's one that we belong to. Um, Whereas among the egg-laying mammals, only the monotremes have survived, and so they are relatively fewer in number nowadays. But the fact that they lay eggs is not really something that they have modified from the original mammal condition. There was a time when egg laying would have been normal for mammals to do. So it's quite interesting that they have kept that ancestral state. That being said, there are a lot of actual weird things about monotremes, things that they have actually kind of changed from the ancestral condition. Um, because I feel like there are a couple of different misconceptions here, right? Well, one is that egg laying is this weird thing that monotremes do, and okay, it's weird in the sense that most other mammals today don't do it, but the fact that they lay eggs is simply due to the fact that they haven't changed the ancestral condition. Um, but the other thing is that, oh, well, because they have kept this one ancestral condition in mammals, they lay eggs, that means monotremes in general, monotremes today are quote unquote primitive, and that they are doing the same thing that the ancestral mammals were doing like all along. And so if we look at a modern monotreme, they're basically like a Mesozoic mammal that's hasn't changed since the age of the dinosaurs. And that's not correct either, because turns out that monotremes today do all kinds of very bizarre things. And if we take echidnas specifically, for example, the modern group of echidnas probably originated at some point during the Cenozoic, so after the end Cretaceous mass extinction. Um, and what's really interesting is that there are several lines of evidence that suggests that echidnas actually evolved from more platypus-like ancestors. And you probably know what a platypus generally looks like, right? A platypus is a smallish mammal with a flattened snout that looks a bit like a duck's bill, although structurally it is quite different. Um, it's got webbing on its, especially on its forelimbs, so it forages for food, mostly in the water. It swims around by paddling with its forelimbs, and it's got a kind of flattened tail. It's often likened to a beaver tail, but unlike a scaly beaver tail, its tail is covered in fur. Um, and it uses that as a rudder when it's swimming around underwater. And it searches for food mostly on the bottom of bodies of water, so the mud on the bottom, where it will kind of use its bill to detect things like worms and crayfish and other types of crustaceans, small fishes, amphibians, things like that, and it'll eat those small aquatic animals. Um, so a platypus is basically an aquatic forager that spends a lot of its time swimming around underwater, whereas echidnas have taken a very different approach. Echidnas have a very long tubular snout and not a duck-like bill, um, and a very long tongue to go with it. And what they do is that they mostly feed on ants and termites. So they'll go up to an ant's nest and dig into it, and then use a very long, narrow snout and a long, sticky tongue to kind of fish ants and termites out of their nests. And so, in this way, they feed very similarly to anteaters and some other types of ant-eating mammals, even though they're not especially closely related to those other anteaters. These are very divergent lifestyles that we see in platypuses versus echidnas, and yet there are several lines of evidence that indicate that echidnas actually evolved from platypus-like ancestors. In a way, you can basically think of them as platypuses that have come out onto land, which is really weird to think about. Um, but it's true. Some of these features that suggest that they had kind of aquatic platypus-like ancestors include the fact that when they are embryos, they actually do start developing a duck-like bill that is lost during embryonic development. For another, echidnas have backwards hind feet. This is something that's really weird. A lot of artists and museum taxidermists have gotten this wrong historically. Um, if you like, take a good look at an echidna, just walking around and such, I take a good look at its hind feet. Its hind feet are turned backwards, so that the toes point backward. And yeah, that's a normal state for them to be. But why would an animal have this? Well, it actually does make sense if you consider that if they were originally aquatic, having these backwards pointing feet would be able to help their ancestors use those feet as a rudder, similar to how platypuses use their hind feet and tail today. Um, and so this is something that probably they inherited from an aquatic ancestor. Um, and also, echidnas are capable of electroreception, and so are platypuses. So basically, they can detect like little electric signals that are generated by the muscle action of other animals. And this is a very useful ability to have if you live in water. So it's certainly very helpful for platypuses, especially because when platypuses are underwater, they close off their eyes, ears, and nostrils. So they're basically like navigating entirely by electroreception when they're underwater, which is like pretty wild. Uh, and so that electroreception thing, that's one of the weird things that modern monotremes do. And there are some other types of aquatic animals that are electroreceptive as well. For example, sharks are pretty famously electroreceptive. They're able to detect like electrical signals in a similar fashion and able to find prey very effectively in that manner. But if you live on land, electrical signals don't transmit as well through the air, so having an electric sense is typically not as useful. And yet echidnas do have electroreceptors. They don't have as many as platypuses do, but they do have some in their snout. And it turns out that they're probably not entirely useless. Because echidnas often like to forage in moist soils, usually for things like earthworms, for example. So, in addition to insects, they also eat worms quite a bit, especially the long-beaked echidna species. And so, when they're foraging in moist soils, they can actually use these electroreceptors to help them detect their prey. So that's quite a interesting adaptation, but they might not have evolved these electroreceptors if it weren't for the fact that they probably evolved from aquatic ancestors. And kind of last but not least, I mean, this is not an exhaustive list, but just as examples of features. Last but not least, the protein myoglobin, which basically stores oxygen in the muscles, the concentration of myoglobin in echidnas is characteristic of mammals that dive a lot, like dive regularly for foraging. There's actually a very strong signal where mammals that dive to look for food have very high concentrations of myoglobin. And it doesn't matter if you're tiny like a water shrew or as big as a sperm whale, this pattern holds like pretty much across the mammal family tree. But there are a few groups of mammals that today mostly live on land and yet have very high concentration of myoglobin, characteristic of diving aquatic mammals. And one of these groups is the echidnas. And so this is another line of evidence that suggests that they descended from these aquatic ancestors. If you're curious, some of the other groups of terrestrial mammals that have like high myoglobin concentrations include elephants and hyraxes, which have also been suggested to have aquatic or at least semi-aquatic ancestors. So that pattern it probably is pretty consistent. In any case, these weird, basically land ant-eating platypuses, once they became adapted to life on land, they kind of ran into a problem here, because echidnas are not very good at running. Now they are incredibly good at digging because they need to use that ability to kind of break into ant nests, right? But the thing is, if you have a limb, if your limbs are good for digging, they have to be very powerful, very strong, with massive muscles on them, right? That means you can't also be good at running at the same time because you're using those same limbs to dig and to run. And whereas if you want to be very good at running, you typically need a very long and slender limb. So basically the exact opposite of what you want in a digging limb. And so an echidna, because they have become adapted to this ant-eating diet, they can't run all that quickly. And their snout has become adapted to feeding on ants and termites, and they have actually lost all of their teeth. So have platypuses, actually. But basically, echidnas don't have any teeth. Their jaws are very weak, and in fact, the mouth is basically restricted, or at least the opening of the mouth is basically restricted to the very tip of the snout, and so they can't bite anything, right? So if a predator comes after them, they can't bite the predator to fend it off. They can't run away from the predator, and they're also not that small either, so they can't hide very easily. Ant-eating mammals are able to get bigger than most other types of insect-eating mammals because their prey is found in very high concentration, so they can eat a lot of it at once and get bigger. But this also has a trade-off because now it's a lot more difficult for them to hide, and so they are pretty well camouflaged, actually. People who study echidnas out in the field have said that it's like nearly impossible to spot an echidna if it's not moving in its natural environment. But if they are found, then they can't just dart under a rock or something and get away from a predator. So you would expect them to basically be sitting ducks. Like they can't run, they can't fight, and it's hard for them to hide. And so a lot of ant-eating mammals have had to kind of get creative with the ways that they deal with predators. They have to evolve some pretty interesting defenses, and that's basically what echidnas have done. And as you can tell from the photos here, what echidnas have evolved are like spines covering most of their bodies. And so what they'll do is, if they are scared or surprised, is that they will use their incredible digging ability to kind of bury themselves in the ground, like very, very quickly in a matter of minutes, until only their very spiky back is exposed above the surface. And once that happens, well, good luck getting the echidna out of the ground without getting spiked. Now, if an echidna in this situation does get pulled out of the ground, or if it happens to be somewhere where like it can't dig itself underground, like on a hard surface, like a rock, for example, what an echidna would do is actually roll up like a hedgehog would do, and kind of turn into a big spiky ball that is very difficult for a predator to get through. Um, so adult echidnas are not commonly preyed upon by other animals, although the juveniles are still vulnerable because they're smaller. Echidnas have done pretty well for themselves, I would say. And I think one of my favorite descriptions of echidna, I think it comes from Jack Ashby. He wrote a book on Australian mammals called Platypus Matters, and he describes the kind of the digging defensive behavior of echidnas as doing jazz hands with all 4 feet. That's how they dig themselves underground, and which is yeah, that's pretty apt. So yeah, echidnas are weird, but they definitely know what they're doing. So, this new study basically kind of reports a previously unknown behavior in echidnas, which I think is quite interesting. So, the specific type of echidna that they studied is the short-beaked echidna, which is found in Australia. Um, Now, there are 4 different species of echidna. So, one is the short-beaked echidna, which is also the best studied and best known species. But there are also 3 species of long-beaked echidna that are found in New Guinea. And as their name suggests, the long-beaked echidna have a much longer snout than the short-beaked echidna. And they also have sparser spines, too. So, the spines don't cover their body as heavily as they do in the short-beaked echidna. And that's probably because they live in a more closed environment. So they're probably a bit more sheltered from predators, or at least find it easier to hide in that forested environment. But the short-beaked echidnas can often be found in much more open spaces, and so probably need that spiny defense a lot more. Um, Long-beaked echidnas are also bigger than short-beaked echidnas, and in general, they're pretty secretive. They're not quite as well studied as short-beaked echidnas, but even short-beaked echidnas still can surprise us, as we'll see in the study here. Um, the authors of this new study basically report observations of short-beaked echidnas feeding on turtle eggs in Queensland in recent years, between 2018 and 2022. Um, and they were able to observe this behavior like both in person as well as on camera traps. And also, they found evidence of this in echidna trackways on like the riverbanks where these turtle nests were. And so, multiple lines of evidence showing that this is a behavior that occurs pretty regularly, which is quite interesting because I just said that echidnas are specialized for feeding on ants and termites, and to a lesser extent, other types of invertebrates. But here we have them feeding on turtle eggs, which is definitely pretty different from what they usually eat. Um, so the authors of the study documented 4 species of turtles whose eggs were being preyed on. And kind of concerningly, this includes 2 species of very threatened turtles. So they're turtles that are in danger of going extinct in the near future. Um, so one of these is the Fitzroy river turtle. Which is endemic to Queensland. It's only found in Queensland and nowhere else. It is a species of turtle that mostly feeds on aquatic invertebrates, so things like crustaceans and snails and worms, and also freshwater sponges too, interestingly. Um, it is a species that was only scientifically described in 1980, so up until relatively recently, we didn't really know that this turtle existed, so that's quite something. And the other species of threatened turtle that whose eggs were being preyed upon by these echidnas is the white-throated snapping turtle, which is highly endangered. It's in fact classified as critically endangered. Um, it is also endemic to Queensland, and it is mostly a plant eater. It mostly feeds on aquatic plants, unlike the Fitzroy river turtle. Now, the white-throated snapping turtle was only given a scientific name, or at least it was only described as a distinct species in 2006, so even more recently. That being said, it was known beforehand, but it was considered the same species as a closely related form called the northern snapping turtle. But that form then got split into multiple species, and so now multiple species are recognized, including the white-throated snapping turtle. Now, despite its name, the white-throated snapping turtle is not closely related to the common snapping turtle or the alligator snapping turtle that those of us from North America might be more familiar with. So both the Fitzroy river turtle and the white-throated snapping turtle are types of what we call side-neck turtles. So the turtles that are alive today can basically be split into two major lineages, and one of these is called the hidden neck turtles. So they are the turtles that can retract their head back into their shell by pulling it back. And these are the turtles that I would say probably most of us, at least in the northern hemisphere, are most familiar with. So think of your red-eared sliders and your snapping turtles, even though their heads are too big to actually be pulled inside. They are members of the hidden-necked turtle group. Also, sea turtles are members of this group as well. Soft-shell turtles. But there is a second group, a second major group of turtles called the side-neck turtles, which are mostly found in the southern hemisphere. And they, instead of pulling their head backwards into the shell, what they'll do is they'll actually turn their head sideways and duck it under the rim of the shell. So they are able to protect their head with their shell, but they do it in a very different way from the hidden-necked turtles. And so the Fitzroy river turtle and the white-throated snapping turtle are both types of pleurodires, and they're about as far related, they're about as distantly related from a true snapping turtle as you can be while still being a modern turtle. Yeah, a little bit of a misleading name there. In fact, both of these turtles are pretty closely related to the Mata turtle of South America, or actually, that one has been split into multiple species now, so it's probably more accurate to say Mata turtles of South America, which are one of the weirdest turtles of all time. But this story is not about them. Now, an interesting ability that a lot of side-neck turtles, including both of these species, have is that they can actually breathe underwater using the lining of their cloaca. So the cloaca is basically an opening that reptiles have where waste comes out of, and it's also where they kind of lay their eggs from too. Basically, these turtles are often said to be able to breathe through their butts, and that's not wrong. That's not inaccurate to say. They are actually able to extract oxygen from the water using this butt breathing method. Now, the reason these two species of turtles are threatened with extinction, there are multiple reasons, as is often the case, but a major one is through habitat destruction by the damming of the rivers that they live in. Because when the rivers get dammed, as in when people build dams through these rivers, that changes the water oxygenation of the river and the temperature of the water, and also ends up flooding a lot of the riverbanks that these turtles nest on. And furthermore, if these turtles get washed over the dams, that can also injure or kill them. And so there are like these multiple types of threats that they face from the damming of rivers, unfortunately. And so it was I would say, a pretty big surprise to find that one of the things that was threatening these turtles was the fact that echidnas are feeding on their eggs, because you don't expect echidnas to be eating turtle eggs. Based on their camera trap observations, as well as some in-person observations, so the particular photos on this slide, they were taken on an in-person observation that the authors made of an echidna feeding on these turtle eggs. The way that these echidnas fed on turtle eggs was that they would walk over the riverbank and use their snout to probe into the sand. When they found a turtle nest this way, they would stop over the site and then kind of repeatedly sink their snout into the sand. And in doing so, they would kind of poke a hole with their snout in the buried eggs. And then from there, I suppose, it can be assumed that they would use their long tongue to kind of lick up the insides of those eggs. And since the inside of the egg is liquid, you don't need teeth or a very large mouth to be able to eat the inside of those eggs. So that suits the echidnas pretty well. I have to say, I was pretty surprised when I read this description of how the echidnas echidnas were feeding on turtle eggs, that they were using the snout to kind of break through the eggshell without actually digging the eggs up. Um, because the snout of echidnas, even though we call them, uh, even though they're often called beaks, as in the names short-beaked and long-beaked echidnas, they're not really structured like a bird's beak. Like they're not covered in hard keratin, so they're actually covered in more of a flexible skin, really. So I think it would be more accurate to call them snouts and not beaks. So you don't really expect them to be used for like poking holes in things, or breaking through a hard object like an eggshell. Um, but thinking about it, it actually is not that far fetched, because it turns out that echidnas will use their snout as a lever, for example, when they're digging. So they'll kind of raise the head when they're digging to kind of shovel out soil, for example. Um, and apparently echidnas are very good at escaping from things when people try to catch them. And so one of the escape stories I've read regarding echidnas is that when people try to put them in, for example, a big plastic bin, like a garbage bin, for example, echidnas are actually able to climb up to the rim and then get their head over it. And once they get their head over it, they can use their snout as, again, a lever to kind of pull themselves up. They do a big pull up with their head and then flip over the edge and then escape. So it turns out that snout is quite a bit stronger than it looks. And so I guess it's not that surprising that it can be used to poke a hole in a turtle egg. Incidentally, I had to look this up because when we think of eggs and eggshells, you probably think of like a chicken egg with a very hard and crispy eggshell, right? But it turns out that not all vertebrates that lay shelled eggs have an eggshell like this. In a lot of non-bird reptiles, like many of the lizards, for example, the eggshell is a lot more flexible. It's almost leathery. It's more pliable. And so in that case, the eggshell is not such a hard obstacle to break through. Now in turtles, there are some species that lay um, leathery shelled eggs similar to lizards, but there are also others that lay hard shelled eggs similar to birds. And I had to look up like what type of eggshell these two species of turtles laid, and it turns out that these turtles lay hard-shelled eggs. So yeah, these are not like simple leathery or at least soft leathery eggshells. These are the actual hard-shelled eggs that the echidnas are still able to break through using their snout. So pretty interesting behavior. The researchers were especially concerned regarding the predation on the threatened species of turtles, because these turtles were being preyed on more frequently than the non-threatened species of turtles that were also being preyed on. In fact, there were only a few incidents of like other species of turtles being preyed on. The majority of the predation events occurred on these two threatened species, and of these two, especially on the Fitzroy River turtle nests. And in fact, they found that there was a trend of increasing predation on Fitzroy River turtle eggs by echidnas over the period of time that they were doing these observations. In 2022, which was the last year that they were doing these records, the frequency of predation on Fitzroy River turtle eggs by echidnas had increased to almost 50%. So specifically, it's 47.4%. That basically 47.4% of the nests that were on the riverbank were getting like destroyed by these echidnas. And the reason that Fitzroy River turtle eggs were being preyed upon more often than the white-throated snapping turtle eggs is probably because, well, first of all, they have thinner eggshells, and for another is because they tend to bury their eggs at shallower depths. So when echidnas, remember, they're walking on the surface and poking their snout down, it's a lot easier for them to find these Fitzroy River turtle nests than they are compared to the white-throated snapping turtles. Now, the reason that there has been this increase in predation rate over time is not known. It's going to require more study. But a few possibilities exist. For example, it may be that habitat alteration, basically by humans, for example, encroaching on the habitat of the echidnas, has led them to seek other food sources than they normally would. So that's a possibility. Or maybe the echidnas are performing this as a learned behavior. So basically, more echidnas are figuring out that they can eat turtle eggs, but it might not be an innate thing that they already know. So yeah, we don't know for sure, but these are a few possibilities that have been suggested, and should be carefully monitored to make sure that they don't, accidentally wipe out these endangered turtles. Um, it is one of those kind of awkward things when in conservation sometimes, because echidnas are a native species to the area, right? They're from Australia, so there there is nothing, quote unquote, wrong with them being there, and they're just kind of going about their natural behaviors. Um, you sometimes still get these situations where uh, if you're trying to protect a threatened species that's already facing um, like many other threats to its survival, perhaps if they had a healthy population, they would be able to absorb this predation pressure just fine. But currently, they don't. They're very rare, and so losing almost 50% of your nest to echidnas in a single year. That's quite a lot. And echidnas aren't the only animals that are eating these eggs, right? Like the authors also note things like monitor lizards and dingoes and, well, quote unquote, Australian water rats, more commonly known nowadays as rockali, were feeding on these nests too. And so all these animals together, plus whatever like pressures that humans are exerting on these turtles, and you can quickly see how that would add up. And so yeah, it's an interesting situation. It'll be interesting to see how these conservationists assess whether or how they'll deal with this in the future, whether it'll be necessary for human intervention to occur. But it is a very interesting behavior. We learned something new about echidnas, um, and something that isn't really discussed in the paper is that. Uh, a lot of these mammals that I kind of alluded to earlier that are specialized for feeding on ants and termites, things like um, anteaters and also things like pangolins, for example, like they all share this characteristic of having like these very long tubular snouts that can't really open very wide, and in many cases they don't really have any teeth, or even if they do, their teeth aren't really used for much. Um, these animals, they certainly are very specialized for eating ants and termites, and that is the majority of their diet in the wild, but it has long been known that they can survive on other food sources, especially in captivity, because in captivity it is often not very practical to just like feed an anteater, a bunch of ants every day, right? How are you going to get those ants? So in captivity, these ant-eating animals are often fed on like a mixture of different sources of protein. Of course, I'm sure it varies by species and the specific husbandry practices of wherever they're being kept. But some common kind of ingredients that go into the diets of these animals in captivity include, well, sure enough, eggs, but also things like mincemeat or like dried pellets, and of course some insects too. It's just not you can't just give them an ant nest every single day. So these animals they can survive on other types of food sources, and occasionally people have observed in the wild some of these animals eating things other than uh, ants and termites or invertebrates more broadly. For example, we do know that anteaters will sometimes eat fruit in the wild, um, and usually it has to be like pretty ripe fruit where the fruit is very mushy because the anteater can't just take bites out of the fruit, right? So it has to have a pretty mushy consistency for them to feed on it, but they do eat it sometimes. Something that's kind of cool, actually, is that we might have mentioned the show Zaboomafoo on our series before. It's a children's show that aired in the early 2000s that basically taught kids about animals. And in every episode, like the hosts, the presenters would interact with like actual live animals in the setting that they called Animal Junction. And in one episode featured a giant anteater, and he talked about like the adaptations that anteaters have for feeding on ants, and also adaptations that ants have for defending themselves against anteaters. Um, Now there was a recurring kind of feature in this show where it was like there was a contraption called the snack machine, and oh man, when I was watching this show as a kid, I so wanted the snack machine because the way it worked was that it had these buttons with like pictures of different animals on them, and you press the button of a specific type of animal, the snack machine would dispense the type of food that the animal liked to eat. In this episode with the giant anteater, they actually did use a snack machine to kind of feed the anteater. And they were like, well, what would an anteater eat other than ants, right? And so they pressed the button for the anteater, and out came an avocado. And they actually showed the anteater like eating the avocado on the show. And they mentioned that yeah, sometimes anteaters will eat fruit, but not a lot of it. They still mostly eat ants. Um, and so we're kind of seeing an example of that with these echidnas feeding on eggs here. And yeah, okay, I think I finally said all I have to say about the story. Do you have anything to add to this?
I think that's a very great introduction to echidnas. Um, I guess it kind of goes without saying that echidnas are not red and have spiky knuckles and can run really fast.
Right.
Something got lost in translation there. Um, but honestly, it's a fascinating study, and yeah, I remember reading a little bit because about how zoos feed ant and termite eating mammals. Because growing up and even now, I had a little golden book about zoo animals, and it was basically how zoo animals were cared for, like back in the 50s and 60s, right? And even then, like they used like a meaty egg and nut like soup that they would feed these animals.
Hmm,
So like hearing about this story, I'm like, that kind of makes sense. I guess that's within their palate to eat eggs.
hmm,
Um, the only thing I'll comment though that's kind of interesting to me is like this idea of natural predators just being natural predators and still
right.
being a threat to endangered species. Because and of course I forget the exact name of the animal, but uh, there was a study a couple of years back on chimpanzees
Hmm.
where they were doing a similar thing with a type of manga bee, I think.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Um, that was a critically endangered manga bee, and like the chimps, because of course chimps are omnivores, they eat a very wide diet, and they'll hunt these monkeys. Um, and like it had gotten to a problem because they were hunting, this critically endangered manga bee that already had enough on its plate as it is, and so
Yeah. Hmm.
hearing about this reminded me of that. Um, it's such a strange phenomenon because it's like, how do you navigate that from a
Right.
conservation standpoint? I mean, you can't just stop them from doing that. That's their natural behavior. Um, so yeah, I'm definitely curious about how that would work. Um, but this is a fascinating study. Thank you for sharing this.
Of course.
Now, I will say, apologies in advance to any fans of monotremes, marsupials, xenarthrans, afrotherians, lipotyphlones, bats, urocondylgyres, pherans, and perissodactyls, because the remaining stories on this news episode, it's all artiodactyls.
Oh my God. How did that happen?
They were fascinating and we liked them, and so we're gonna go with that. So um, moving on to my first mammal paper or artiodactyl paper. Um, this is by Javier Barrio, Alicia E. Gutierrez, and Guillermo de Elia, and it's a bit of a twofold discovery combo. So, the first major discovery is the recognition of a new species of deer, and the first for many decades, and the first of the entire 21st century thus far, which is pretty nice that we're still finding, new artiodactyls in the 21st century. Um, Now, the second big discovery is, of course, the actual process itself of how this was done, how this new species came to be described. And so I'll go into that deeper now. But first things first. So the deer clade, the Cervidae, is divided into two groups based on the nature of their metacarpal bones. So there's Cervinae, which is like muntjacs, elk, fallow deer, and their relatives, and then Capreolinae, which includes moose, roe deer, reindeer, and then this entire wonderful assemblage of American species in a clade called Otocoilinae. Now, for some time, there has been difficulties in truly understanding the diversity of this group, as previous research has suggested that many of the genera may not be natural groups. That is, they're not monophyletic. One of these, and this is our focus for today, are the pudus of the genus Pudu. These are the smallest species of deer in the world and are tiny little things. They only reach about 60 to 82 centimeters long and 25 to 43 centimeters tall at the shoulder, which is comparable to, say, a basset hound. Pudus are animals of the Andes mountain range in South America, where they live a rather cryptic existence in the high forests and grasslands feasting on plant browse, twigs, and nuts. Um, Prior to the publication of this particular paper, two species were recognized. There was a northern species, which is Pudu mephistopheles, which is found in the Andes of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and a southern species, Pudu puda, of southern Chile and Argentina. Both species were distinguished by their size, the southern species being larger, as well as in their coat coloration and their preference in altitude. Interestingly, some early reports by European colonists suggests that these deer probably had a much larger range and were probably more social herding animals, like many deer around today. But in recent times, it's suggested that the encroachment of people may have actually shrunk their range and modified their habits so that now they're mostly solitary, except in the breeding season. So, way back in 1913, zoologist Oldfield Thomas studied the smaller species in the clade Otocoline and concluded that the two pudu species were probably better understood as separate genera, owing to many differences in skull morphology, the lack of preorbital glands in the northern species, which is found in other deer, and it aids as a sort of scent maker and antimicrobial compound producer, which is kind of neat. And for this, he coined a new genus called Pudella for that species. So that would make it Pudella mephistopheles. However, his proposals were rather quickly dismissed, and just 2 years afterwards, that new genus was sunk into Pudu, and the former arrangement was reestablished. Now, 109 years later, Barrio's team have returned to this question of whether Thomas's proposal was actually onto something. Other researchers during this time have looked at the other American deer, and they have just found paraphyly everywhere. So paraphyly refers to a clade of organisms that excludes some of its descendants. So the best example I could give is reptiles as traditionally understood. Normally that wouldn't include birds, but we know that birds are a type of reptile because they're a type of dinosaur. So reptiles in a monophyletic sense would include that group. But colloquially, reptiles are only like turtles and lizards and crocodiles, so we wouldn't think of birds as being in that group. But that would make it paraphyletic. Case in point here, some scientists argued, in at least two examples, that the genus Mazama, so that's the 10 species of brocket deer, also included the pudus, and that one of those brocket deer actually belonged into the same genus as the white-tailed and mule deer, Otocoleus. So, regardless of the study, there seemed to be indications that there were more to pudus than met the eye, including the possibility that they were not each other's closest relatives after all. And of importance here is the northern species, P. mephistopheles. Although it inhabits a distinct range from the southern species, the northern pudu is actually found in only two distinct areas that do not overlap. There's a population from central Colombia to northern Peru, and another in eastern Peru, divided by the Huacambamba Depression, which is a sort of dip in the mountain range that splits the wet forest habitat in two by the sliver of dry forest between two rivers. And this has seemingly kept these two populations from interacting with each other naturally, so much so that they too have developed their own distinctions in size, coloration, and morphology. And this was the major clue that the team used to try to answer the question of Purdue taxonomy. They sampled a number of museum specimens representing all the pudus and gathered molecular data from each, along with a large selection of other Otocoilini, much of which had been previously collected in earlier research. And these were all then plugged into a phylogenetic analysis, as well as several principal component morphological analyses from cranial data that the team also gathered, as Thomas had used skull data as part of his earlier argument for generic separation. And the resulting phylogenetic tree indeed further revealed just how messy and insane the taxonomy of Otocoilini really is. So to just kind of go into the branching order a little bit of this family tree, It indicates that the reindeer or caribou are either a sister species to this group or its earliest diverging member. I mean, that's another discourse that we can't get into right now. Um, then we find that the genus Mazama was indeed majorly paraphyletic. It encompassed three successive clades, the first of which we find the white-tailed mule and Yucatan brown deer nested inside it. And also that genus seemed to be paraphyletic too. Um, and the two others allied closer to the pudus. Now, the genus pudu was indeed shown to be also paraphyletic. The northern species branches off first, and then the southern species, which is more closely related to the Huai mule, pampas deer, and some of the other brocket species as well. Now, if that sounds confusing, that's because
Mm,
it is. Clearly, this is a clade of organisms that is in some need of very serious, full scale research and resolution if we are to get
mm,
anywhere in truly understanding it. But for now, at least, the situation with the pudus has become much clearer. The team proposed a new classification, which is, in a sense, kind of the old classification. The northern pudus are clearly a distinct genus from the southern pudus, and so they resurrected Pudella from Taxonomy and used it for that. But that was not all. The observed differences between the two northern populations um, uh, was supported by the phylogeny and the principal component analysis. And so this is ultimately where the first new deer of the 21st century comes from. The eastern Peruvian population, or what they call the Peruvian Yungus pudu, is now to be known as Pudella carlae, after Carla Gazzolo, as, and I quote, a form of showing high esteem to her. Her actions helped save the life of the first author after a life-threatening vascular problem.
wow.
So kudos to her. Um, the southern pudu remains the genus pudu, while the other northern population gets to keep the northern pudu common name as it has the wider range of the two. And of course, the illustrations shown here by Omar Custodio show these three species for direct comparison. So there's the two northern ones, Mephistophile and Carlae in Pudella, with Carlae here in the middle, and then Pudu Puda at the right. Um, but of course, to drive the point home, the authors, do call very serious attention to the situation regarding the American deer of Otokoilani.
Mm,
Um, if you go into this paper right now, you'll see that it is just a mess. The fact that nearly all of the genera and even a few of the species of these deer were found to be paraphyletic. That is remarkable,
gosh.
especially regarding those brocket deer in Mazama. Um, in fact, the authors even note in this paper that Mazama is probably an artifact of several distinct lineages of deer, which have either A, retained ancestral morphologies in all this time, or B, that there is some serious convergence that has gone on. Although I think the former is probably more the case. Um, but that the team had managed to shift the boundaries of what a pudu really is seems to be at least one step in the direction of cleaning up this clade. Um, so I thought that that was really a fascinating paper to highlight. It is kind of neat to see, again, new hoofed mammals in this day and age. You would think these are so big and charismatic that we would have found them all by now.
Mm,
But granted, the pudus are the smallest species of deer that are smaller than some dog breeds, so I wouldn't be surprised if there were some mysteries among them as well, considering they're
mm,
also rainforest dwellers in highlands of all places. They're not exactly the easiest mammals to study.
right.
In fact, Pudella carlae, in the species description, there is next to no behavior or natural history for this
Mm,
animal. The team like noted observations about like what they were eating and kind of where they hang out at, but breeding, reproductive times, all that, we have nothing. So certainly, there's much to anticipate in the future as Pudella carlae is studied more. Um, but I definitely wanted to share this paper. Albert, did you have any comments or things you wanted to say?
I mean, this is an incredibly cool study. Like, I do have a soft spot for pudu. I mean, who doesn't, right? Like, they're tiny deer. That's just cute in itself. Certainly, growing up, like reading animal books, they always get brought up as being, well, the smallest deer in the world. But otherwise, you don't really get much about them, I suppose, in most of the books, and understandably so, because as you mentioned, they're not the easiest animals to study out in the field, and so when I saw that there was this new um, paper out on poodoos, and even one that describing a new species to boot, like that was definitely quite something. Like I definitely thought that was incredibly cool. Like possibly even more surprising than the new species was, as you mentioned, like the whatever's going on with that phylogeny. Because yeah, that sounds just crazy. Like the brocket deer, like they don't actually go together, and wow, like I mean, admittedly, I wouldn't say I know that much about deer or specifics about deer species, so maybe some of these results are more surprising to me than they would be to someone who actually is familiar with the morphology and the ecology of these animals. But that just sounds like a mess to me. Like it is wow. That is wild. That is wild. I wish the deer phylogeneticists good luck with sorting that out because dang. But overall, yeah, I think there's a lot of really cool material to take away from this paper. And I'm really glad that you picked it for this month's news episode.
Definitely. And before I close off here, like I'm definitely curious about what Jose R. Costello is going to do because there's hints that as part of his Princeton Field Guide series, where he's a wildlife photographer and zoologist who has printed a series of very wonderful field guides in recent years. Um, one on bovids, one on canids, one on cats and hyenas. Um, and
Hmm.
there's very strong hints that he's going to do deer next.
Hmm.
Um, and probably like a handful of other small related artiodactyls as well to kind of fill it up. You'll probably put pronghorns and um, chevrotins in there at least. But he seems to follow very closely any recent phylogenetic changes um, in the literature. So I wonder how he's going to deal with otocoilomy when the time comes. Is he going to use the old taxonomy, or is he going to have to wait to keep publishing because all this new stuff is
Right.
coming out? We'll have to see, but I highly anticipate that because those books are great. But yeah, what do you have to say for us?
Yeah, so let's go on to the next slide. And yes, to kind of echo your earlier comments, even though our last three remaining stories are all about artiodactyls, we do have to issue an apology to fans of bovids, giraffes, pigs, hippos, and camels, and some other groups too, because it turns out that our last two stories are both very specifically about a very specific group of artiodactyls, the toothed whales. So, if anyone listening to this has not gotten the memo, yes, whales are a type of even-hoofed mammal or artiodactyl, even though they don't have hooves anymore, but they are. Evolutionarily nested within that group. There is no way to make a group that is only the land-living artiodactyls without including whales when you're thinking from a phylogenetic standpoint. Whales are a group of artiodactyls, are kind of like the surprise party members of this clade. Um, and specifically, our last two stories are all about toothed whales, so also apologies to fans of baleen whales as well. But they are very interesting stories. So let's get to it. This is another study that is describing a new species, but this time it's a fossil species, and specifically, it's a fossil dolphin. Uh, but I guess that raises the question, like, what is a dolphin? And the answer might be less straightforward than perhaps you would expect. Um, so typically when we think of dolphins, uh, what probably immediately comes to most people's minds are the bottlenose dolphins, like your mental image of a dolphin, or the typical dolphin you would normally see in popular culture is probably based on bottlenosed dolphins. Um, and so bottlenose dolphins and their close relatives, they form a group called the oceanic dolphins, or the Delphinidae. And I would say, like, in the very strictest sense of the word dolphin, um, like, these are the true dolphins. Like, if these aren't dolphins, then nothing is a dolphin, basically. So the oceanic dolphins are, like, kind of the core group of the baseline, the default dolphins that we refer to by that term. Um, However, there are a few other groups of uh, toothed whales that we also call dolphins. Um, these include um, a number of different groups that today are primarily found in freshwater environments and not marine environments. And so the name oceanic dolphin is meant to kind of distinguish like the delphinids from these other freshwater quote unquote dolphins. And so the freshwater groups are commonly called river dolphins. And they come in several different groups. So there are the South American river dolphins, found in the Amazon River basin. There is some debate about how many living species of them there are. Some say one, some say like up to three, perhaps. But they're the South American species of river dolphins, also called boto. Um, and they form a group called the Inuidae. Closely related to them is a species called the La Plata dolphin, or franciscana, and although it is often like talked about in relation to the river dolphins, it is not a strictly freshwater species. It does like go into estuaries, but it mostly lives in coastal marine environments off the coast of eastern South America. There is a third group that is closely related to these two, that is not technically probably alive anymore, but was until very recently, and that is the Chinese river dolphin, or baiji, which lived in the Yangtze River basin um, in China. It is probably, unfortunately, extinct. So I don't think the International Union on the Conservation of Nature has like officially declared it extinct yet, but basically it probably is. Like habitat destruction and pollution probably did it. And there were attempts to breed it in captivity, but unfortunately they were all unsuccessful, and there has been no confirmed record of a wild one in many years. And I remember hearing the news in the mid 2000s when it was declared that it was probably extinct, and that yeah, that's it's pretty sad because, of course, any species going extinct is sad, but also the fact that we're losing like this very distinctive lineage of animal, not fun.
Mhm.
Um, but until recently, that would have been a third uh, group of river dolphin by certain applications of that term, if you count the La Plata dolphin as a river dolphin. Um, and then there is a fourth group that is not so closely related to these three. The fourth group is the South Asian river dolphins, called the Platanistidae, and they're found in the Ganges, Indus, and Beas rivers, as well as like some smaller associated rivers. And so we have these four, until recently five, groups of river dolphins, with some fuzziness there, with the in the case of the La Plata dolphin, as well as the group of oceanic dolphins that are all called dolphins. Um, However, things like the beluga and the narwhal, as well as the porpoises, are actually more closely related to the oceanic dolphins than the oceanic dolphins are to any of these river dolphin groups. And so yeah, you can immediately see that the term dolphin does not refer to a specific clade or like a specific lineage of toothed whales, right? It's actually it's actually a name that's applied to multiple different groups, like separately. So there is no real dolphin group unless you are willing to count belugas, narwhals, and porpoises as dolphins, but most people don't. Um, and furthermore, we might also have to count the beaked whales in that group as well. But again, they're usually not called dolphins either. The term dolphin really is a term for various groups of usually medium-sized toothed whales, and usually these mid-sized toothed whales with long snouts. But again, that is also a bit fuzzy because there are some types of oceanic dolphins, quite a few types actually of oceanic dolphins, where they have pretty short snouts that are almost more porpoise-like, um, and yet everybody still calls them dolphins anyways. So,
Mm.
yeah, it's kind of a fuzzy term, and I don't think there's a real like consistent definition you can apply to say like these things are dolphins and these things aren't. It's just something that's been kind of passed down from tradition. And it is true that the river dolphins do resemble what our traditional conception of what a dolphin looks like. So sure, we can call them dolphins, but we just have to keep in mind that these common names they don't really strictly apply to evolutionary or even ecological categories. Now, the long snout in these dolphin groups is often called a beak, but again, similar to the case with echidnas, it is not really structurally like a bird's beak, so that's a little bit of a misnomer. Um, and so it's kind of funny, like if I had a nickel for every time a group of mammals had a snout that was called a beak when it probably shouldn't be, like that's I'd have two nickels at least. In any case, uh, if you want to make things even more complicated, uh, there are some types of toothed whales that live in freshwater environments, but aren't members of any of the river dolphin groups that we just talked about. So there are actually some types of oceanic dolphins that can be found in fresh water. It's like some populations of the Irrawaddy dolphin, which is one of the oceanic dolphins, actually live in fresh water. The takushi is a South American species of oceanic dolphin that is entirely freshwater. So this is a freshwater oceanic dolphin. Are you confused yet? Um, and there's also some populations of finless porpoise, which, as its name suggests, is in fact a porpoise that live in fresh water as well. And so, yeah, so you have, my goodness, like cetacean common names are really confusing, aren't they? So you have dolphins that kind of aren't really dolphins, um, and you have dolphins that live in the river but are actually oceanic dolphins. So, yeah, like maybe we shouldn't think too hard about it and just try to live with the language best we can. Um, but in any case, um, the new species of fossil dolphin that this new study presented is a type of extinct river dolphin. So it actually belongs to one of these river dolphin lineages that I mentioned earlier. Um, Now, this new species was described from the Miocene of Peru, so in South America, and it's about 16.5 million years old. It is based mostly on this partial skull, as pictured on the slide here. So you can see that it's got this very long snout, which is characteristic of many of the river dolphin groups. They tend to have like these longer and narrower snouts than the oceanic dolphins do. The researchers who named it called it Pebanista yakaruna. Well, what type of river dolphin is it? Since it's from South America, the logical kind of assumption probably would be that this is a close relative of the South American river dolphins, the botos. Well, it turns out that this apparently was not the case, because when these authors ran phylogenetic analyses, including this new fossil form, it turns out that its closest living relatives are not the South American river dolphins, but instead the South Asian river dolphins. Okay, so that's really weird. What is a South Asian river dolphin doing in South America? How did it get there in the first place? Well, the thing is, all of these um, freshwater dolphins and other freshwater cetaceans, um, they must have all had ancestors that originally lived in the sea. So they are descendants of marine toothed whales that ended up colonizing freshwater environments. We have fossil evidence of this. Indeed, these fossil like relatives of South Asian river dolphins have basically been found in the fossil record all over the world and in all over the world's oceans specifically. So, like these marine proto river dolphins were everywhere during the Miocene. And so, probably what happened was that one of these lineages of marine proto river dolphins ended up uh, in the South Asian river systems and gave rise to our living South Asian river dolphins. But then, independently, another lineage from the same group ended up in South America and gave rise to this fossil species, Pebanista. And so it represents an independent origin of freshwater adaptation within the stem platanistids. This is quite interesting because we don't have any fossil evidence of the South American river dolphins being present in South American freshwater ecosystems during this time. Um, in fact, the earliest evidence of stem group South American river dolphins is much later in the Miocene, between about 7 to 9 million years ago, at least in terms of when they were around in freshwater habitats. So probably Pebanista was around in South American river systems before the modern South American river dolphins had gotten there. Quite an unexpected find, I would say. I don't think anyone would have predicted that before there were South American river dolphins proper in South American river systems, there would have already been relatives of South Asian river dolphins there instead. So, how did Pebanista live? Well, something else that's quite special about Pebanista is that it is much larger than any of the living river dolphins. It is estimated to have been around 3 meters long in total length, whereas in living river dolphins, 2.5 meters long is like a big river dolphin, and usually they're much smaller than that. And it does share some features with the modern South Asian river dolphins, although there's a pretty good chance that they evolved independently as independent adaptations to a freshwater environment. So something that's quite notable is that the eyes of Pebanista, as well as South Asian river dolphins today, are incredibly small. Like they're very, very tiny. And river dolphins in general often have very small eyes because the rivers that they live in are often very murky and muddy. So there isn't much point to having big eyes anyway. There's not much to see. That being said,
Mm.
I actually read. Granted, this was Wikipedia, so I didn't track down the paper trail for this. Um, at least on Wikipedia, I read that the South American river dolphins actually have pretty decent eyesight, even though their eye size is pretty small. Their vision still seems to be like reasonably important. But certainly in the South Asian river dolphins, the eyes are like so reduced that they are nearly blind. In fact, like their eyes are basically only useful for telling light from dark, from what I've heard. And primarily, what they use to navigate is their ability to echolocate. And you probably are aware that dolphins in general, and indeed toothed whales in general, are able to echolocate. Basically, they can send out very, very high pitched calls into the water, and those sounds will bounce back to them if they hit like obstacles or like prey items ahead of them, and like give them some information about what the environment around them is like. And so river dolphins are very reliant on echolocation to navigate in these very murky waters. And in fact, I should mention that really echolocation should be considered like the distinguishing characteristic of the toothed whales, because you think about modern whales today, and they're split into baleen whales and toothed whales. And the baleen whales, they don't have any teeth. Instead, inside their mouth, they have like these hair-like structures called baleen. Whereas toothed whales instead still have teeth. But the truth is that it's kind of like a situation with the monotremes, right? Like the toothed whales having teeth is not something special that they gained during their evolution. It's just that they never bothered to change the fact that their ancestors had teeth, which is like the normal condition for vertebrates in general, right? Or these jawed vertebrates. So the fact that they have teeth is not really like a specialization that distinguishes them as a group. What really distinguishes them is their specializations for echolocation, And so probably arguably a better common name for the toothed whale lineage is the echolocating whales. And indeed, it is probably the fact that they have echolocation is what allowed them to colonize the freshwater environment so many different times. Remember, like we just talked about like a ton of different times that they've independently gone into fresh water, and like Pebanista just adds yet another example of this. Because they have this echolocation, they can navigate in these murky rivers with no problem. So like the modern South Asian river dolphins, Pebanista probably relied mostly on echolocation and not on vision. Um, but because it was quite a bit bigger than the modern river dolphins, and in addition, we know it has some pretty big teeth because you can see here in the top right corner, you can see the tooth sockets along the jaw of a Pebanista. It has some pretty big teeth, which suggests that it could probably take some pretty big prey, so like pretty decently sized fish. And the ecosystem that it lived in, we know, was pretty rich in biodiversity. So there were all kinds of like turtles and various crocodilians, and certainly like small individuals of those aquatic reptiles probably would have been eaten by Pebanista. Like the modern South American river dolphins, for example, will eat things like piranhas and turtles and such. So if you kind of scale up to something somewhat bigger, then you can kind of imagine the types of things that Pebanista might have been capable of taking down. Um, I think it's really interesting to think about what this ecosystem must have been like, because we have this, relative to the South Asian river dolphins in South America at a time when there weren't any South American river dolphins, at least not that group. And furthermore, there are also extinct relatives of gharials in the same ecosystem as well. So the gharial is like this crocodilian, has an extremely long and narrow snout that is found in South Asia today. It feeds like almost entirely on fish and not much else, and it is one of like the iconic kind of species in freshwater ecosystems of South Asia today, much like the South Asian river dolphins are. I, of course, I say, of course, like it's a done deal, but I know a lot of people of our age probably had like the field guide to Cetaceans of the World by Mark Carwardine, and in that
Hmm.
field guide, it's actually mentioned that one of the animals you could potentially confuse a South Asian river dolphin for is a gharial because they're found in the same environments. They both have these very long, narrow snouts with like teeth sticking out of them for catching fish, and sometimes the river dolphins will kind of poke their head out of the water, and when they're doing this, you might mistake them at a glance for a gharial or vice versa. And so it's kind of funny that you have like early relatives of both of these lineages, gharials and South Asian river dolphins, at this time in the mid-Miocene in South America, um, doing their thing. What a curious kind of ecosystem that must have been to witness. And so, yes, quite an unexpected find. A proto South Asian river dolphin in South America that got bigger than any living river dolphin does today. So, quite a surprising find, and certainly one that caught my eye over the past month. Do you have anything to add?
This is exciting. I mean, obviously, like the geographic kind of mix up is really neat to see, and also just the fact that this animal was enormous. I
Yeah,
mean, like for a river dolphin,
for a river
um,
dolphin.
what a sight that must have been. Um, it really makes me think. I, I'm sure we all have fossil wish lists that we have made that some of us have thought about for a while. I know Darren Naish has quite a few. Take a drink.
Yeah, right.
Um, but so I understand because I did look this up that there's a type of Sousa dolphin, Atlantic humpback dolphin, I think, that will go into like West African rivers on
I think so,
occasion.
yeah.
Yeah, but to my knowledge, there is no traditional river dolphin that we found that has colonized African riverways the way
Right.
that they have in South America or or in Eurasia. So
Mhm.
kind of like I kind of like to see if we could ever find a fossil like that. If at some random point in the Cenozoic, um, we find one of these,
Yeah,
that would be on my wish list for sure. An African river dolphin that's not like a delphinid dolphin.
right.
No, this is really exciting, and I mean, for a partial skull, it's quite good.
Yeah.
I mean, judging from what I'm looking at, I mean, they got the blowhole, they got the orbits, they got like most of like the brain center part of the
Right.
skull. Um,
Mhm.
so I'm very happy to see this. Hopefully, we find more.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if it's just a skull and some isolated fragments, maybe. Of course, this is always the thing. What if we got like a Dinocyrus situation going on? Like
Right, right.
it's back heavy or something. It's just very weird for a dolphin. Oh, that would be great. Um, but yeah, speaking of dolphins, then let's move on now to our final news story. So this is my second artiodactyl slash toothed whale paper slash dolphin paper. This comes to us from Philip A. Morin and colleagues. So the orca or killer whale is perhaps one of the most recognizable species of whales in the world. It is the largest living member of the oceanic dolphin clade, Delphinidae, and of course, echoing what Albert spent a while talking about. Dolphins are a type of whale. They do not form a clade. Obviously, the term whale has a colloquial nature, but I guess it technically refers to all the members of Cetacea, which includes the dolphins and the porpoises. But it's not really that big of a deal to really focus on. But yeah, we call them killer whales. They're technically dolphins, which are technically whales, and that feed them. So, anywho, yeah, the orca is very recognizable, and its popularity might give the impression that we know just about everything important about these animals, but that is never a good impression. And indeed, there has been a decades long discourse about just what constitutes orcas in the world today. Now, what do I mean by this? Ever since the days of Linnaeus in 1758, the orca has been recognized as a single species, Orcinus orca, which is named from Latin words that were borrowed from Greek that either refer to a type of whale or to tuna, because it was thought that they either looked like tunas or they ate them a bunch. It's difficult to say. But the labeling of all orcas as Orcinus orca has been questioned for some time. Multiple studies in the 1970s and 80s had realized that orcas everywhere did not look or behave the same. In the North Pacific Ocean, for example, there were different types of orcas that could be distinguished by everything from their group structure and seasonal ranges to their calls, to the shape of their fins and the style of their white markings. And a similar situation occurs in the southern oceans around Antarctica and in the North Atlantic Ocean, too. As per the conventions of zoology, many different researchers approached this situation in different ways and asked different questions. What did all these types of orcas represent? Were they regional variants? Were they races? Were they subspecies? Were they even distinct species? How could we tell? I've seen some comments about this new 2024 study that I feature here, as if this was some sort of new revelation in orca research. But in fact, this is just the latest in a long running discussion that has been underway for some time. Cetacean researchers and enthusiasts alike have suspected that Orcinus orca should be split up somehow. But for years, the research has been few and inconclusive. So rather than dedicate this entire segment to just this newspaper, I'm going to try to trace the history of orca research into this discourse to see how things have progressed. Just kind of see like where this paper stands in relationship to that. So when orcas were first scientifically described, the nature of marine life was still a bit inaccessible to many, and there were these huge mysteries that remained. Thus, there is a whole catalog of different species names proposed for what we now know as orcas around the world, dating between the 1840s and the 1870s. And these have all since been synonymized into Orcinus orca. The oldest paper by modern zoologists that I could find came from the Soviet Union in a 1981 report by Yuri A. Mikalev and colleagues for the International Whaling Commission. That team analyzed the various catches of Antarctic orcas from Soviet whaling expeditions in the 60s and 70s and distinguished a smaller species that they called Orcinus nanus. And another Soviet team the following year, Alfred A. Berzin and V.L. Vladimirov, studied data from their own whaling trips within the southern waters, this time near the Indian Ocean, and they described another smaller orca species, Orcinus glacialis. Um, International researchers responded to these proposals almost immediately with skepticism, as the descriptors used to separate Orcinus nanus and glacialis from orca proper were not thorough and included some rather poor qualifiers. And it didn't help that nanus lacked a type specimen, and glacialis's type specimen has since been lost. Further, Soviet, US, and Japanese researchers in the Antarctic have noted distinguishing types of orcas in this part of the ocean. And by about 2003, as described by Robert L. Pittman and Paul Ensor, at least three distinct orca types were recognized here. And by 2010, that number had rose to five. Now, these southern orcas have been designated into um, an Antarctic type that lives purely in open waters. There's a pack ice type that goes after seals on ice floes. There's a Gerlanche type in the Antarctic Peninsula that prefers penguins as well as seals. There's a Ross Sea type that is the smallest and has only been observed eating fish. And there's a subantarctic type that is little understood, but it does have a more distinct melon akin to like a pilot whale.
Hmm.
Now, by 2004, all of this, encompassing research into the various oceans had culminated in this big workshop of cetacean workers in La Jolla, California, the NOAA workshop on shortcomings of cetacean taxonomy in relation to needs of conservation and management to see where the data stood on the status of orca diversity, along other topics. And according to the summary notes, and I will quote here directly, whether the different ecotypes of killer whales constitute a single species, multiple species, or subspecies is not yet resolved. While there are clearly different ecotypes, it is not clear whether they represent a plastic and ephemeral response to changing habitat conditions or the beginning of an irreversible process of speciation. Single species advocates believe the genetic data are not strong enough to argue for long term reproductive isolation, while proponents of the multiple species view disagree. The latter contend that there are potentially two or three species of killer whales in Antarctica, and perhaps others in the North Pacific. The majority view among workshop participants was that multiple species probably exist, at least in Antarctica, and that this might well be confirmed in the future, but that current data are limited, absent, or insufficiently quantified, and therefore that separation at the species level is at this point premature. End quote. And that was really where things stood for some time. But it certainly gave researchers motivation to keep looking and provide that better data. Preliminary observations in the age of genetic studies had found that the different types of orcas little, if ever, interacted with each other, and that they all had somewhat low levels of genetic diversity, which suggested that all of this differentiation was relatively recent as far as deep time goes, on the order of between 40 to 20,000 years ago that this was going on. For example, in 2008, Richard G. DeLuc, Kelly M. Robertson, and Robert L. Pittman, and yes, that's the same Pittman that helped unravel the Antarctic orca diversity,
Hmm.
they studied just the Antarctic orcas and analyzed their mitochondrial DNA and determined no evidence of interbreeding, which hints at the possibility of multiple species, but at that time they exercised caution on definitive statements. Now, Philip A. Morin, and oh, hey, there's his name again,
Mhm.
and colleagues performed a large mitogenome or mitochondrial genome phylogeny of all the world's orcas in 2010. And they found what they thought were actually rather significant divisions in the orca family tree. So rather than diverging at the end of the last glacial period, as the earlier studies had found, Their results showed that orca types had diverged much further back into the Pleistocene. For example, the transient Pacific orcas split from the other orca types some 700,000 years ago. And the latest splits between the types only occurred about 150,000 years ago. And this prompted Moore and colleagues to conclude, and again I will quote, using these criteria, we argue that the combined genetic, morphological, and behavioral evidence of divergence among sympatric types in the high latitude regions of the North Pacific and the Southern Ocean support the recognition of these types as separately evolving metapopulation lineages, and the elevation of three types to species and several others to subspecies status. End quote. But again, on this front, they did not propose any names or definitions. So, up into the 2020s, we have not had any serious publications of new orchid names for proposed species. And that brings us to the present with the Moore et al. Paper featured here. The team shifted focus from the Antarctic waters to the North Pacific whales and conducted a massive review of all the literature that they could find on these animals. So, as I did for the Antarctic, in the North Pacific, orcas have been divided into just three types. There's an offshore type that lives in open ocean waters and hunts for other marine mammals, as well as sharks and schooling fishes. There's a resident type that lives in coastal waters and eats mainly fish and squid. And there's a transient type that eats only marine mammals. And in appreciation for zoologist Michael Bigg, who was a pioneer in Pacific whale studies, that type had been recently renamed and referred to now as the Biggs type of orca. So, as in the others, these whales can be distinguished morphologically and behaviorally. In fact, the images here on this slide, we can see kind of how these whales have been divided and some of their differences. So, for example, the dorsal fins on the top, we have an offshore, resident, and transient or Biggs type. And then we have more full body restorations of the resident and Biggs killer whales, which is going to be very relevant here shortly. Moore and colleagues' review showed to them more than enough evidence now to justify reclassifying the Biggs and resident types as their own species. And their genetic data that they found pointed to divergence times as far back as 350 to 300,000 years, which certainly passes the threshold for species distinctions in other types of cetaceans, for example, in the South Asian river dolphins. So great was this confidence that the team then took that next step. And so now we have proposed names for these species. So the Biggs orcas are thus named Orcinus rectipinus in reference to the tall erect dorsal fin, and the North Pacific resident orcas have been named Orcinus ater after the dark black coloration of this type compared to the others in the North Pacific. It should be emphasized that these names are not necessarily new, but they hail from that early age of orca research all the way back in the 1800s, as the team didn't want to have to worry about coining these new names where old names were already feasible and available, which happens quite a lot in biology. The problem was that the type specimens for those original names had all been lost, so both had been given neotypes, that is, new type specimens to replace the old ones. And this was after, of course, a big scan of all the old literature for descriptions and illustrations that could be accurately used to ally the old names to the living whales that the team were actually studying. And thankfully, they were able to do this. And so now you can actually go to that paper and see, kind of the story of that unraveling and the team's reasoning in greater detail. Now, of course, time will tell if these proposals, go underway and are widely accepted by cetacean and mammal researchers in general. But it is at least certainly clear by now, from the phylogenies reviewed in the paper and all the behavioral data as well, and morphological data, that the other archetypes around the world are going to have to be analyzed just as closely. And, we can see whether these new species are cleanly separated from them or not. So the potential is there to see further publications and even more new names for these other types of orcas. But now, after all this time, we might finally see progress in that age old question: is
Mhm.
Orcinus orca all there is, or is there more to them after all? So this was quite a extensive and thoroughly researched paper, and I spent quite a bit of time kind of digging for papers to trace this paper trail of orca species discourse as far back as I could. And it was a very fascinating thing to research. And Albert, I would love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, wow. In many ways, like as you've already kind of gone over, like this paper has been a long time coming, hasn't it? Like I feel like pretty much one of the first things you learn about orcas, if you ever read, even just a cursory description of their biology, is just how many of these different types there are, and this naturally is going to attract taxonomic discourse. Yeah, it's a great example of how difficult it is for us to define what a species is. I think definitely one of those great go-to examples of that. And certainly, this new paper looks like a really good step in the right direction. Like the way you described how thoroughly they investigated, like the original type specimens, and that's really good kind of foundational taxonomic work. I think regardless of how this ends up shaking out in terms of like do we decide they're separate species or not, it's a really valuable contribution to the discussion the way I see it, and I definitely look forward to seeing like other orca populations get this treatment too, because as you kind of discussed quite comprehensively, we see similar patterns in other parts of the world as well with the different orca types. This is definitely a really interesting taxonomic problem to be working on, but at the same time, I don't envy those who are working on it. Um, so yeah, like good on you, orca researchers, and it looks like a really important study that's going to really move things forward on regarding this conversation.
For sure. And I certainly think the contributions to another discourse regarding orcas in captivity is going to be
Hmm.
especially interesting. Um,
Yes.
Not to go too deep into this sort of thing because it's kind of convoluted and everybody has their own opinions and it's very testy. But the long and short of it is there's been a lot of concern about marine parks that house orcas, and they do orca shows and breeding programs, for example, and whether it's feasible for such large animals to be kept can be healthily kept in captivity in this way. Um, and a big argument against the keeping of orcas in captivity, and of course, there's been a lot of leeway in this discourse, you know, since it kind of first came to light a couple many years ago. Um, but a big thing was, you know, before we really understood orca biology and all of these different types of orcas, you had groups that would go out and catch these animals and kind of put them all in captivity together because Orcinus orca is Orcinus orca. What's the difference?
Hmm.
Um, but if it turns out that you've been trying to like put together and also breed different species of orcas that have been separated and have very little interbreeding with each other for hundreds of thousands of years, that's not really good breeding work.
Yeah.
You might as well be trying to breed lions and tigers together in captivity. Um,
Hmm.
that's how great the differences are in some instances. So I can certainly see this being kind of fuel to the fire of that discourse for sure. Um, but I think what impresses me a lot is again like how thoroughly the team authors went about proposing their new species names, because I think it's important to retrace your steps
Yeah.
when doing this sort of work. Rather than go in fresh and just kind of name new species willy nilly, they realized that they stood on the shoulders of other orca researchers who had done this work and really tried to see kind of where the status was before they decided to move forward with such a big radical proposal.
Hmm.
um, Even going as far back, into the age of like vintage natural history. That is a lot of really good dedication, and I think it sets a very good standard that I would hope many and more zoologists and biologists try to do.
Yeah.
You know, it's. I mean, that's certainly my opinion on that matter. Um, but yeah, I'm curious to see where this would go. Maybe someday in the future, there'll be marine mammal field guides, and we'll be looking at multiple entries for different species of orca. I mean,
Yeah.
that would be what a time that would be. Um, so I definitely thought this was really neat study, not just like as a mammal paper or as a taxonomy paper, but just in a sort of, like you said, like, how we define species paper. Because I mean, we could spend a whole episode, a whole lecture series on what a species is, and
Yeah.
because that is like the topic in biology for a lot of people. Um, but unless you had anything else you wanted to add, um, that's really about it for my paper, my paper presentation here, and that's really about it for our
Yeah.
news stories. We want to thank you all very much for joining us today. Albert, would you like me to close this out?
Sounds good to me.
Alrighty, let's move to the next slide. Of course, we'll go to our usual acknowledgments and advertisements. We are on Patreon. That's patreon.com/time and clades. Um, Patreon is a website where we post previews and exclusive content about our Through Time and Clade series that you can subscribe and send monetary donations of any amount that you like, and you'll get access to that content. We have a tier system where there are successive perks each time you choose. And so, for example, you can suggest topics for us to talk about on the show. You can ask questions. You can even get shout outs. And so, for those of our patrons who are owed shout outs, we want to thank, my sister Julie, and our good friends Paul, Denver, Frankish, Val D'Annunzio, and Tristan as well. So thank you all very much for your support. And of course, all your donations will help us continue this series and develop new projects and expansions. Now, moving on to our general acknowledgments, we want to thank our good friends Henry and Alicia for their contributions to the series. Henry, of course, is responsible for the wonderful theme music that opens each episode. And Alicia is responsible for the color scheme of Albert's Alvarezsaur avatar, cheerful little fellow. Of course, moving on to the next slide, we are still on Twitter. We are at Time and Clades, where we generally post episodes as they air, as well as small announcements here and there. But most likely, y'all are watching us on our YouTube page through Time and Clade. So if you wish to like and subscribe and follow on for notifications, we certainly would appreciate that. Um, if you have any questions at all about the show, whether that be the papers that we covered today or just anything in general, there are three ways to contact us. You can email us at timingclades@gmail.com. You can leave a YouTube comment or you can tweet at us, and we will almost certainly get to those and respond in kind. Now, of course, if you want to read or look at any of the papers or any other references that we talked about in this episode, they will all be in the description below. Of course, we will share the David Attenborough's BBC Mammals interviews and articles and others that we've mentioned as well. But with that, that is the end of Through Time and Clades for now. I want to thank you all so much for joining us. Um, Episode 2 of Humanity a Prologue is currently in the works. Again, as I'm kind of figuring out my work schedule and kind of managing the time that I can have to work on the show, I do not have a definitive schedule for releasing episodes yet. They're going to basically be released as I finish them. But progress is being made, resources are being gathered, and so hopefully, at least within the next month, estimating, keep an eye out for that. But otherwise, we'll have our news episodes that we regularly do, and who knows what else will kind of show up on the horizon. Time will tell. But with that, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Take care, everybody.